The morning air was brisk, the kind that sharpened the senses and made a man walk a little taller. Malik Henderson stood just outside Hamilton Tower, a monolith of glass and steel that loomed over the downtown district like a monument to power. He smoothed the front of his dark blazer, checked the time on his watch, and took a slow breath. He had arrived early, but that was intentional. Malik had learned long ago that when you came from where he did, being early wasn't just polite. It was protection. Inside the lobby, the marble floor gleamed beneath polished shoes. Tall glass windows framed the skyline. It was the kind of place that whispered wealth with every light fixture and leather chair. Malik walked in, confident but calm, the sound of his footsteps crisp against the echo of the space. Heads turned, some briefly, others lingering. He felt their eyes like a draft, not one of curiosity but of caution. He had seen it before. Many times, he approached the reception desk and offered a short smile. "Good morning. I'm here for a 10:30 appointment." "With Nicole Marsh, Fairview Realty." The receptionist, a young white woman with tight curls pinned into a neat bun, glanced up. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "And your name?" "Malik Henderson," she typed, eyes flicking between her screen and him. "I don't see anyone by that name listed." He pulled out his phone. "I have the confirmation right here. She said she'd meet me here in the lobby." She glanced at the phone but didn't lean in. "You'll have to wait off to the side, sir. Please don't block the desk." He nodded once, politely, and moved to a nearby chair in the waiting area. He sat with his back straight, his briefcase balanced on his knee. Minutes passed. People moved around him. Some glanced his way, others whispered. He could feel it, the quiet tension, the silent question in their eyes. Why was he here? 10 minutes passed. Then the first guard appeared. Thick-necked, mid-40s, white with a belt that clinked slightly as he walked. He approached Malik with practiced authority. "Excuse me, sir, can I help you?" "I'm just waiting on an appointment." Malik replied calmly. "Nicole Marsh, Fairview Realty, I'm here early." The guard didn't budge. "We've had reports of someone loitering near the reception. I need to see some ID." Malik raised an eyebrow but complied. "No problem." He handed over his driver's license. The guard examined it with exaggerated care, then looked Malik up and down. "And you said you have a meeting here?" "Yes, at 10:30, with a realtor. I'm a client." The guard didn't respond. Another man approached, taller, younger, also white with a rigid stance and narrowed eyes. "This him?" The second guard asked. "Apparently," the first replied. "I've got confirmation on my phone," Malik added, holding it up again. "Email, text, whatever you need." But they didn't look at the phone. "We'll need you to wait outside until your contact arrives." Malik sat very still. "I was told to meet her here. I'm not causing any trouble." "Let's not make this a problem," the second guard said, stepping closer. Malik stood slowly, not because he wanted to leave, but because he knew what happened when black men stayed still too long under the wrong gaze. "I'm not making a problem. I'm here for a professional appointment." The receptionist looked down at her screen, pretending not to hear. People had begun watching now. A man near the elevator raised his phone discreetly, angling the camera toward the exchange. A woman whispered into her phone, her eyes wide. And still, Malik remained calm. "I'd like to wait here," he said again. "I have a legitimate—" "We're going to have to escort you out," the first guard interrupted. And that was— They didn't shove him, but they didn't need to. They flanked him on either side and guided him toward the door. Each step Malik took felt heavier than the last, the polished floor beneath him now echoing louder. He kept his eyes ahead, jaw tight, hands clenched around his briefcase. The humiliation wasn't loud, it was quiet, almost silent, but it was thorough. He was walked through the same doors he had entered just 20 minutes earlier, not as a potential buyer, but as a problem removed. Outside, the cold wind slapped his face like an insult. He stood on the sidewalk, staring up, at the glass tower that had just decided he didn't belong. People walked past him, glancing, moving on. Inside, the guards returned to their posts, The receptionist went back to her keyboard, and the building swallowed the moment whole like it never happened. But it had happened, and the phones had caught every second of it. Malik stood there, breathing, through his nose and out through his mouth, remembering every instance in his life that led to this one. Every time he'd been followed in a store. Every time a client was surprised that he was Malik Henderson. Every teacher who had mispronounced his name. Every banker who asked for proof of his income. He had built something out of nothing. A tech company from scratch. Hundreds of employees. Offices across 2 states. Clients that included Fortune 500 companies. But to them, in that lobby, in that moment, he was just another black man who didn't belong. The phone buzzed in his hand. A text from Nicole. "I'm in the lobby. Where are you?" Malik didn't answer. He slipped the phone into his coat pocket and stared up at the name etched in silver near the top of the building. Hamilton Tower. He had come to buy space in it. Now, he was thinking about something bigger. Not revenge. Ownership. Malik remained on the sidewalk, staring into his own reflection in the tower's glass. He saw what they saw, an educated, successful, poised black man. And somehow that was still not enough. Or maybe it was exactly the reason they felt uneasy. The kind of presence that demanded space without apology. He had learned long ago. That visibility came at a cost, especially when you didn't fit the expected mold. The ache in his chest wasn't just from what had happened. It was the weight of repetition. The knowledge that this wasn't an isolated incident. That no amount of suits, titles, or net worth had shielded him from being reduced to a threat by 2 uniforms and a receptionist's assumptions. He walked slowly to his car, unlocked the door, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The silence inside offered no comfort, only space for the sting to settle deeper. For a long time, he just sat there, watching people come and go from the building he had almost stepped into as an owner. His phone buzzed again. Nicole called this time. "Malik, are you here? I've been looking around. Did something happen?" He stared at the screen. His thumb hovered over the decline button, but he answered instead. "I was escorted out." There was a pause. "What? Why?" they thought. "I was loitering. Security removed me before you arrived." "Oh my God, Malik, I'm so sorry. It's fine," he interrupted softly. "Happens more than you'd think." She was still speaking, scrambling to apologize and suggest a reschedule. But his mind had already moved elsewhere. He hung up gently, then pulled out his other phone, his business phone, and opened a document he hadn't looked at in weeks. It was a portfolio file labeled Urban Ownership Initiative. It detailed a long-term plan to expand his holdings beyond tech, into real estate, into legacy. He scrolled until he reached the notes on Hamilton Tower. He had wanted a few floors, a headquarters, a symbol. But now he was thinking bigger. What if he bought the whole thing? What if the very building that deemed him unworthy bore his name on its deed? He stared at the renderings, the spreadsheets, the projected revenue. His fingers tightened around the phone. Maybe they had done him a favor. Maybe they had just reminded him of who he really was. That night he sat with his mother over dinner. She watched him closely as he pushed vegetables around his plate, his jaw tight. "Something's on your mind," she said. "I can see it in your shoulders." He looked up. "I got kicked out of Hamilton Tower today." She paused mid-bite. "You?" They didn't know who I was, just saw me waiting. Decided I was trouble. She set her fork down gently. "You okay?" "I'm tired." "Of what?" "Of proving I belong." She reached across the table, took his hand. Her skin was soft but firm, weathered by years of work and sacrifice. "You don't have to prove anything. You are everything, and they know it. That's what scares them." He didn't respond right away. Then he said, "I think I'm going to buy it." She blinked, then smiled slowly. "Of course you are." The video had barely been online for an hour when the comments started pouring in. Some were outraged, rightfully so, demanding accountability, tagging news outlets, reposting the clip with captions like, "This is why we still protest." But then came the others. The ones asking questions that weren't really questions. What did he do before the camera started? Maybe he was being difficult. Why didn't he just leave? Malik read them all, every single one. He didn't know why he tortured himself with it. Maybe because somewhere deep down, he needed to know how people really saw him. Not just the ones who called themselves friends. Not just clients and colleagues who shook his hand with practiced warmth, but the public, the anonymous crowd, the collective voice that judged in headlines and hashtags. His inbox flooded. Some messages from journalists wanting statements. Some from activists offering solidarity. A few from past acquaintances checking in. And then, there were the ones from people he hadn't spoken to in years, old classmates, former co-workers, even a high school teacher. They all seemed to remember him now, but none of it settled the fire in his chest. He sat in his apartment that evening, lights dimmed, dinner untouched on the table. The news had already picked it up. Tech CEO mistaken for intruder at prestigious office tower. The headline made him laugh, dry and bitter. Mistaken. They didn't mistake anything. They made a decision, one rooted in everything he had spent his life trying to rise above. He turned off the television. The silence in his home echoed louder than any headline. Every wall felt like it was pressing in. He thought of the receptionist, the way she hadn't even flinched, of the guards standing shoulder to shoulder daring him to protest, and of the people in the lobby who had said nothing. His phone buzzed again. It was a statement from the Hamilton Tower management. We are aware of an unfortunate incident involving one of our guests and members of our security staff. While we regret any distress caused, we believe the misunderstanding arose from miscommunication. The safety of our tenants and guests is our highest priority. Miscommunication. That word sank like stone in Malik's stomach. Later that night, he scrolled through old photos on his phone. Not of board meetings or business trips, but of childhood, images of simpler days. He paused on a picture of himself, at age 9, standing outside a corner store, grinning with a blue raspberry popsicle in his hand. It was taken 5 minutes before a shop owner accused him of stealing. He had forgotten about that day. The man had grabbed his arm, accused him of hiding candy in his pockets. He remembered crying, insisting he didn't take anything. His mother had come back in, furious, demanded an apology. She got one, but only after threatening to call a lawyer. That was the first time Malik learned that being innocent wasn't enough. He remembered being followed in stores as a teen, called articulate by surprised teachers, and asked if he was really in the right class when he raised his hand one too many times. At a college party, someone had tossed him keys without looking and asked where he parked the car. Later, when he was the keynote speaker at a tech conference, a hotel staff member mistook him for the valet. He had swallowed every one of those moments, told himself it was just ignorance, that if he worked harder, earned more, climbed higher, the world would change its mind. But today had proven otherwise. His success hadn't changed the system. It had only disguised its boundaries. The next morning, Malik stepped into his office, sleek, modern, a space he'd designed with intention. His assistant gave him a soft smile, avoiding eye contact. A few team members lingered outside their doors, unsure of whether to say something. He could feel the discomfort in the air, not because of what happened, but because it had become undeniable. He didn't speak much, just nodded, went straight to his office, closed the door. Later that afternoon, he received a call from Walter Brenner, the building manager at Hamilton Tower. The man's voice was polite, measured, almost too polished. "Mr. Henderson," he began, "I wanted to personally reach out and apologize for what occurred yesterday." Malik didn't reply right away. Brenner continued, "I've reviewed the footage. It appears there was some confusion. Our staff believed you were, well, uncooperative. And with recent security concerns, I'm sure you understand how easily tensions can rise." Malik's voice came quiet but firm. "I showed my ID, gave my name. Had confirmation on my phone. What part of that was uncooperative?" There was a pause on the other end. Brenner cleared his throat. Yes, well, I'll be reviewing our protocols to ensure incidents like this don't happen again. Incidents like what? Malik asked. A black man being early to a meeting? Another pause. I understand your frustration, Mr. Henderson. We value all our potential clients. Malik ended the call without another word. He stared at the AC, phoned for a long time after that, fingers clenched around it like it might break. The mask of professionalism Brenner wore was worse than the outright aggression of the guards, because it pretended to be civil. It wore politeness, like a shield. He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the window. His office overlooked the city skyline. Somewhere out there was that same building, that same lobby, that same receptionist, that same silence. A knock came at the door. It was Simone, his head of HR. Hey, she said gently. You doing okay? He nodded once. Working. Through it. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. I saw the video, and I just want to say, what they did to you? It was wrong. I know we don't talk about these things a lot here, but you don't have to carry it alone. He exhaled, his chest relaxing just slightly. Thanks, he said. It's just hard to explain how deep it cuts. You do everything right, and in one moment, none of it matters. I know, she said. We shouldn't have to be perfect just to be treated like people. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of truth settling gently between them. When she left, Malik opened his laptop, not to check emails, but to open a new document. He typed 3 words at the top of the screen. This is war. Not a war of fists, a war of ownership. If they wouldn't let him walk through the front door as a guest, he'd come back through it as the owner. He wasn't broken. He was reminded, and that made him dangerous. Malik stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. The words sat there like a spark in the dark, quiet but undeniable. He didn't yet know what would come next, but he knew it would be different. The man who sat quietly in lobbies smiled through microaggressions and kept his voice even while others raised theirs. That version of him had been burned away. He thought of his younger brother Marcus, who once said, "The higher you climb, the harder they try to remind you where you started." Back then, Malik had brushed it off, told Marcus he was being too bitter. But now he understood. It wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. He opened a folder on his desktop labeled Legacy Ventures. It had been dormant for months, a passion project. He'd shelved while focusing on mergers. The concept was bold, acquiring commercial real estate in elite areas and repurposing parts of it for community advancement. Tech incubators, mentorship hubs, scholarship spaces. At the time, it felt too ambitious, too soon, but now it felt urgent. His phone buzzed again, this time with a news alert. The video had hit national coverage. A segment would air that evening on one of the major networks. A panel was already assembled to discuss racial profiling in business spaces. Malik sighed. They would talk, they would argue, and then they would move on. But he wouldn't. He closed the laptop and stood, walked to the large window overlooking the city. He had built everything he had with sweat, silence, and sacrifice. But silence had cost him enough. This time, he wouldn't play the part of the wounded executive waiting for justice in a press release. He would take the insult they handed him and build a monument with it, not to shame them, to outgrow them. The sun dipped below the skyline, casting gold against the city's sharp lines. Malik made a quiet promise to himself. They would remember the day they dragged him out, because it would become the reason he owned the building they stood in. Malik didn't leave his apartment for 3 days. The curtains stayed closed, the blinds drawn. Emails went unread. Meeting invites were declined. He ignored calls from colleagues, his assistant, his realtor, even Nicole. It wasn't about avoiding people. It was about facing himself. Because when he looked in the mirror now, he didn't see the man who built something out of brilliance and drive. He saw the man who had been walked out of a building like he didn't matter, Like nothing he had done was ever enough. The silence should have felt like rest. Instead, it was a trap, loud and accusing. Thoughts spun without pause. He questioned everything. Was it even worth it? All those nights grinding while his friends were sleeping. Every networking event where he forced smiles and downplayed discomfort. The carefully tailored suits, the code switching, the calculated pauses to make others feel less threatened. He had done it all right. Still, they had tossed him out like he was nothing. He sat on the couch in sweats, watching the sun trace the walls as it moved across the sky. He watched the news replay the clip, saw pundits debate the racial implications. Some defended him. Others said the guards were just doing their job. What job was that exactly? Keeping black men out of buildings they could afford to buy. By the fourth day, the weight of solitude began to shift from numbness to suffocation. He grabbed his keys and drove. No destination, no music, just the sound of tires on asphalt. After 30 minutes, he found himself pulling up to his mother's house. He hadn't planned to go there. His hands just turned the wheel like muscle memory. She opened the door before he knocked. Like she knew. "You been eating?" she asked. Before even saying hello. Trying, she stepped aside, letting him in with a quiet nod. The living room looked just as it always had. Pictures on every wall. A scent of cinnamon lingering from a candle burned the night before. It was the kind of space that made you breathe slower. Malik sat down on the edge of the couch, elbows on knees. "I think I'm done, Ma." "With what?" "All of it. The business, the expansion, the deal. I don't know why I even tried." She didn't rush to respond, just sat across from him looking at him the way only a mother could, with history in her eyes. "You know," she said softly, "your grandfather tried to buy land once." Malik looked up. "They wouldn't sell." To him. Told him it was already spoken for. But it wasn't. They just didn't want a black man owning part of that block. He came home that night, sat right in this room and said, "My grandkids will own what they won't let me touch." The room went quiet again. She leaned forward. "He didn't know your name back then, but he was talking about you." Malik swallowed hard, words trapped behind the pressure in his chest. "I feel like I'm pretending, like they were right all along. I don't belong in those rooms." She shook her head. "You don't pretend, baby, you perform, because you think that's the only way they'll accept you. But that building, that boardroom, you don't belong in them because you performed. You're way there. You belong because you earned it, and they're scared of that." That night, Malik went home and sat in his car outside the building for nearly an hour before walking in. He checked the lobby, half expecting to see someone watching, but it was empty. Quiet. Sterile. When he got to his office, the city lights blinked back at him through the glass. The window used to inspire him. Now it mocked him. His reflection stared back, blurry and faint against the glittering skyline. He whispered to it like it might understand. "Am I just a symbol? A face they're willing to tolerate until I ask for too much?" He pulled up his email. One message stood out. A simple subject line. "Change of heart." It was from an investor he had pitched weeks ago. A major one. The message was short. Regretfully, they'd decided to pass. "We appreciate your time, but given recent publicity, we are choosing to reevaluate our exposure." Exposure. The word stung more than he expected. Another email arrived shortly after. A partner he had been finalizing a deal with had also pulled out, citing reputation concerns. The spiral was quick. He closed the laptop, stood, and paced the office. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about how fragile his seat at the table really was. It looked solid until it wasn't. His entire business felt like a sandcastle. Impressive, until the tide turned. He called Andre, his oldest friend. A real one. Andre answered with a joke, trying to lighten the air. But Malik cut to the point. "Do you ever feel like none of this is real?" "What do you mean?" "Like everything I built isn't mine. Like it could be taken away the second someone decides I don't deserve it. Andre went quiet. Then, I think you're finally seeing the truth. The system doesn't care how brilliant you are. They let us sit in chairs they can pull out at any moment. So what's the point? Andre exhaled through the phone. The point is, keep standing, even when they pull the chair, especially then. Malik didn't say anything for a long time. The next morning, he walked into the office. Most people kept their heads down, unsure of how to approach him. Some looked guilty, others just curious. He noticed who avoided his eyes. He noticed who said nothing. In his private conference room, he stood at the window again. This time, he didn't just see a building. He saw a symbol, a test, a line drawn in marble and glass. He whispered to himself again, not a question this time, but a vow. I'm not done. Later that afternoon, Malik sat alone in the office's small break room. He stared into his coffee, not drinking it, just watching the ripple where the heat touched the surface. The hum of fluorescent lights above him was the only sound in the room. Normally, this was where his team gathered, laughing, sharing stories, planning the next pitch. But now, it felt like a hollow echo chamber. He wasn't just mourning a business setback. He was mourning a belief that merit was enough, that excellence would protect him, that if he made it big, he'd finally escape the invisible leash tied to the color of his skin. He thought again about the investor who pulled out. The words reputation concerns played on a loop in his mind. What part of his reputation exactly? The video? The fact that he was the one dragged out, not the one doing the dragging? Or was it simply because his face had reminded the world of a truth it preferred to ignore? He returned to his desk and opened the blinds. There it was, Hamilton Tower, cold, distant, gleaming. He watched it like a man studying an enemy. Not out of hatred, but out of understanding. That building wasn't just made of steel and glass. It was built with assumptions, with quiet rejection wrapped in polite smiles, with barriers that didn't wear badges but existed in invisible policies, in who gets to speak in meetings, in who gets escorted out even with ID in hand. Malik leaned back, his mind drifting to the early days of his company, when he was pitching investors out of a cramped co-working space, staying up until 3 a.m. to write code, sacrificing weekends, skipping meals to afford server upgrades. The grind wasn't just for success. It was to prove he belonged. Now, years later, he was still proving, still asking rooms full of people to see past what made them uncomfortable. The door creaked open. Jenna, his marketing director, peeked in. Hey, you got a second? He nodded. She stepped inside, hands clasped, hesitant. I wanted to say, we've got your back. The team's just unsure how to talk about it, but everyone's talking. About it? Malik nodded. I figured. We shouldn't have to wait for stuff like this to happen before speaking up. I'm sorry. You don't need to be sorry, he said quietly. Just don't be silent. She gave a small, sincere nod, then left the room. That night, Malik opened the old journal he hadn't touched in years. Its cover was worn, the pages creased from travel. Inside were scribbles from his early days, quotes that had moved him, affirmations he used to whisper when doubt crept in. He turned to a page where his handwriting was bolder, firmer. They might own the gate, but I own the key I built myself. He traced the words with his thumb. Then he flipped to a blank page and began writing. He poured out everything, anger, sadness, fatigue, but also clarity. He wrote about how every barrier had made him sharper, more dangerous, more aware. How silence was no longer survival, it was surrender. And he wasn't ready to surrender. By the time he closed the journal, the sky outside had turned ink black. Only the faint glow of city lights shimmered against the window pane. In the days that followed, Malik began moving differently. He called his lawyer to reopen negotiations for the building, this time through a shell company. He contacted his PR consultant to schedule an interview, not to defend himself, but to declare his next move. He even reached out to a nonprofit, to discuss opening a scholarship in his grandfather's name. But most importantly, he made space for himself. One afternoon, he visited a small elementary school in the neighborhood where he grew up. The principal, an old friend, had invited him to speak with the fifth graders. He hadn't done anything like that in years, but he felt compelled. He stood in front of the class, not as a CEO, not as a headline, but as Malik from East Briar. A boy raised by a mother who taught him how to stand tall without apology. A man who had seen the ceiling and chosen to push anyway. He looked at the young faces in front of him, all wide-eyed and waiting. Sometimes, he said, you're going to walk into rooms where people don't expect you, and sometimes they'll try to push you out. But that doesn't mean you don't belong there. It means they're not ready. He paused, letting it settle. Be ready anyway. When he left the school, the sun felt warmer. The weight he'd carried so quietly started to shift, not disappear, but move to a place where it fueled him instead of drowning him. That evening, as he sat in his car looking once more at Hamilton Tower, he didn't see rejection anymore. He saw opportunity. He saw reclamation. He saw the next chapter, one he would write with steel instead of silence, because if success still had a ceiling, he'd raise it brick by brick. Not for acceptance, but for transformation. Danielle Ortiz didn't knock. She never had to. She moved like someone who didn't waste time on formality, and Malik respected that. She stepped into his office unannounced, a leather folder tucked under one arm and determination in her eyes. I've been following everything, she said, sitting down across from him before he could even offer a greeting. And I think it's time you stop surviving and start pushing back. Malik didn't answer right away. He was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. The backlash, the media storm, the quiet distancing from some of his investors, it had drained him, but he listened. Because if there was one person who never sugarcoated the truth, it was Danielle. She opened the folder. This isn't about suing. It's about owning, literally. I dug into Hamilton Tower's real estate holdings. There's a path to buying. It won't be easy, but it's doable, if you're willing. Malik looked at her, a slow breath filling his lungs. The last thing he wanted was another fight. But as he looked at the outline she'd sketched out, legal paths, ownership options, historical precedents, he realized it wasn't about confrontation. It was about reclamation. What if I'm just building something that can still be taken? Way, he asked quietly. Danielle leaned forward. Then make sure it's too big to steal. You've earned your place, Malik. Time to build something that reminds them of that every single day. That night, Malik called his legal team and instructed them to quietly form a shell company, Westland Holdings. Under it, he wanted to resume negotiations for commercial shares in Hamilton Tower. No headlines, no public association, just strategy. It wasn't a lawsuit, it was a playbook. He didn't want apologies, he wanted leverage, and so the quiet war began. His staff noticed a change. Malik walked differently, spoke with purpose again. Meetings that had been awkward and hollow began to feel sharp and grounded. He wasn't just going through motions anymore, he was charting a course, one that led directly into the rooms they'd once tried to escort him out of. Investors, initially spooked by the incident, began circling back. Not because Malik begged, but because he restructured his message. He didn't pitch them returns. He pitched them redemption. This isn't just property, he said in a Zoom meeting with 3 equity partners. It's legacy. We're not just taking space, we're reshaping it. Support began to rise again, both inside and outside the company. His longtime team members rallied behind him. One intern created a mock ad with Malik's photo and the tagline, "Dragged out. Now he's buying in." It went viral. Malik hadn't asked for the attention, but he didn't hide from it either. The hashtag #MarWalkBackIn trended for nearly a week. Activist groups picked up the story. Local community leaders invited him to panels. Though Malik declined most interviews, his silence only made the movement louder. He didn't need to explain his actions. People understood. Still, not everyone was rooting for him. Walter Brenner, the building's long-standing manager, had begun to suspect something. He couldn't pinpoint why. Just that too many. Inquiries were being made, too many document requests, and always from shell corporations, third-party brokers, silent partners. It didn't sit right with him. He began slowing things down. Requests were lost. Paperwork was incomplete. One file mysteriously couldn't be located at all. Malik's legal team flagged it as obstruction, but they kept their cards close. Malik didn't flinch. He doubled down. More shares were acquired. Quietly, legally, strategically. Then came the tipping point. An old investor in Hamilton Tower, someone with controlling stake, reached out through a mutual contact. He was aging, retiring, ready to liquidate. He didn't care who bought it. He just wanted a clean deal. It was the opening Malik had been waiting for. In one meeting, after months of groundwork, Malik secured the final piece of the puzzle. The silent acquisition of the building was set in motion. Contracts were drafted, signatures collected, funds transferred. And just like that, Hamilton Tower, the same building that once denied his presence, now bore his ownership. He didn't hold a press conference. There were no balloons, no cameras, just a single internal email to all tenants. Ownership of Hamilton Tower has officially changed hands. The new majority stakeholder is Westland Holdings. Walter Brenner received the memo. He read it twice, then again. His face went pale. The man he once dismissed as a trespasser now owned the ground beneath his feet. Malik didn't gloat. He just smiled quietly in his office, watching the sun pour across his desk. He had walked in once as a guest. He'd returned as the owner. But the story didn't stop there. 2 days after the email went out, Malik scheduled a meeting, not with press, but with his staff. Every team, from interns to senior directors, packed the conference room. No one knew what he was going to say. He stood at the front of the room, hands folded, gaze steady. "When I started this company," he began, "I thought success meant protection. I believed if I worked hard enough, played by the rules, and earned my place, the world would see me differently." He paused. The room was silent. But that day in the lobby, I learned something else. Success doesn't shield you from prejudice. It doesn't erase who you are in the eyes of people who've already decided you don't belong. Some of the staff looked down. Others stared straight at him, eyes filled with respect. "I didn't respond with rage," Malik continued. "I responded with vision, with strategy, and with all of you backing me, we turned that rejection into a return." He took a breath. "I own Hamilton Tower now. But what I really gained, what we gained, is proof. That we don't have to wait for permission to lead, to build, to belong." A standing ovation erupted. Tears welled in a few eyes. People clapped not just for what Malik had done, but for what he reminded them was possible. That night, after everyone had gone home, Malik sat alone once more in his office. He opened his journal and wrote a single line. "They thought they were removing me, but they were making room." He closed the book, stood up, and walked to the window. The city lights blinked back like stars, each one a reminder of how far he'd come and how far he could still go. The elevator ride was quiet. Malik could hear the mechanical click of each passing floor, but inside, everything was still. He had stood here before, days ago, months ago, on the day they pulled him, out like a trespasser. But today, the silence wasn't hollow. It was heavy with purpose. When the doors opened to the ground floor, Malik stepped into the lobby like it belonged to him. Because it did now. He walked across the marble tiles, those same ones that once echoed under the heels of security guards, as they escorted him out. Today they echoed back his own steps, stronger, more certain. Tenants were gathered, forming small clusters, murmuring, checking their watches. An internal memo had announced a building-wide meeting. No one had said why. The security desk came into view, and there he was, the same guard, same posture, same uniform. But his eyes, they changed the moment they recognized Malik. The man straightened, confusion giving way to shock, and then something closer to regret. He stepped forward, maybe out of habit, maybe unsure what to say. But Malik didn't. Stop walking, didn't flinch. He passed the guard with nothing more than a glance, a subtle nod that said, "I see you. I remember." Danielle stood near the podium set up at the front of the lobby, surrounded by reporters and staff. She gave Malik a small nod as he approached. Walter. Brenner was already at the microphone. His voice was rehearsed, and though his tie was straight, the strain in his throat was hard to miss. "As many of you know," Brenner said, "Hamilton Tower has recently transitioned majority ownership. Today, we are honored to welcome someone who brings with him not only business acumen, but a bold vision for this building's future." He turned toward Malik. "Please welcome Mr. Malik Henderson." Applause rose, not explosive, but respectful, growing with every second. Some clapped politely, others with genuine pride. Malik stepped up, adjusted the microphone, and scanned the room. "I want to thank Mr. Brenner for that introduction," he began. "But let's talk plainly. I've been here before." Silence settled across the lobby. "I stood in this very spot, with a meeting scheduled, credentials verified, and respect shown. But what I received was none in return. I was questioned, accused, and then removed, publicly. Not because I broke any rules, but because someone decided I didn't look like I belonged. Some people shifted uncomfortably," he continued. "I could have sued, I could have shouted, but I chose something harder. I chose to come back with ownership." A few gasps broke the tension, more applause, stronger this time. Malik's voice was calm, but every word landed with weight. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for clarity, for accountability, for growth." He looked to the security desk, all eyes followed. "To the man who escorted me out that day, I offer you a choice. You may stay, if you're ready to acknowledge the harm caused and join us in rebuilding with intention. Or you may step aside." The guard's face flushed. He bowed his head. "I'll resign." He left the lobby with nothing but the sound of his own footsteps. Malik turned back. "We cannot build inclusive spaces by pretending past wrongs didn't happen. We heal by facing them." He took a breath and his tone softened. "That's why today Hamilton Tower begins a new chapter. We're implementing anti-bias training for all staff, inclusive hiring practices, and a racial equity pledge, signed by every leadership member, displayed permanently in the lobby." More applause now. Cameras clicked, phones recorded. But Malik didn't speak for headlines. He spoke for the people who'd never had a mic in their hands. For those who were never offered choices. "This building," he said, "used to make people like me feel small. That ends now." He stepped down from the podium. The first hand that reached out to him was from a janitor. "You gave us all a win today," the man said, his voice shaking. Malik didn't smile out of pride. He smiled out of peace, because this wasn't the end. It was the stand, and he took it like a king. After the tenants' meeting ended, many stayed behind. Not because they were required to, but because something had shifted. Some stood in quiet conversation. Others simply watched Malik as he moved through the lobby. They had heard his words, but more than that, they felt the weight of them settle into the foundation of the building itself. Danielle joined him by the side wall, arms crossed, eyes bright. "You know," she said, "I've seen CEOs throw millions around to feel that powerful for 5 minutes. You just spoke for 10 and built something that'll last a lifetime." Malik chuckled, but the expression didn't quite reach his eyes yet. "Was it enough?" he asked, quieter than before. "It was everything," she replied. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, the building's new equity plaque was installed just beside the security desk. Stainless steel, bold letters etched deep. "This building stands for equity, dignity, and inclusion. For everyone, always." Below, did Malik's signature, and beside his, the signatures of every department lead, including Brenner's. He hadn't said much after the meeting, but he signed. That alone meant something. Malik stood back, looking at the plaque for a long time. He thought of his grandfather, Denied the chance to buy land in a county that now bore his grandson's leadership. He thought of his mother, who worked 2 jobs so Malik could focus on building. He thought of every version of himself that had once felt too quiet to be heard. That night, he went home and stood on his balcony, looking out over the city. Lights blinked like soft reminders. This is yours too. You earned this view. His phone buzzed. Messages poured in, congratulations, interviews, praise. But one caught his attention. It was a voice memo from a former classmate he hadn't spoken to since college. I saw the video. I used to think the system would change on its own. Today you reminded me it won't. But people like you will. Malik sat down, letting the city breathe around him. A week later, a national magazine ran a cover story titled "From Removed to Ruler: The Man Who Took Back the Tower." The image was striking. Malik standing with folded arms in front of the Hamilton Tower entrance, the equity plaque gleaming in the background. But for Malik, the real moment came quietly. It was a Wednesday morning. Normal day. A young black boy, maybe 15, walked through the lobby with his father. They stopped in front of the plaque. The boy looked up and read it aloud. "Dad, he owns this place?" The man nodded. "Yes, he does." The boy looked around with new eyes. "So that means I could too." Malik, passing by, overheard. He paused, offered a small nod, and kept walking. He didn't need thanks. That moment was the reward, because that's what a real stand does. Not just break barriers for one, but make space for many. After the tenants' meeting ended, many stayed behind, not because they were required to, but because something had shifted. Some stood in quiet conversation. Others simply watched Malik as he moved through the lobby. They had heard his words, but more than that, they felt the weight of them settle into the foundation of the building itself. Danielle joined him by the side wall, arms crossed, eyes bright. "You know," she said, "I've seen CEOs throw millions around to feel that powerful for 5 minutes. You just spoke for 10 and built something that'll last a lifetime." Malik chuckled, but the expression didn't quite reach his eyes yet. "Was it enough?" he asked, quieter than before. "It was everything," she replied. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, the building's new equity plaque was installed just beside the security desk. Stainless steel, bold letters etched deep. "This building stands for equity, dignity, and inclusion. For everyone. Always." Below it, Malik's signature, and beside his, the signatures of every department lead, including Brenner's. He hadn't said much after the meeting, but he signed. That alone meant something. Malik stood back, looking at the plaque for a long time. He thought of his grandfather, denied the chance to buy land in a county that now bore his grandson's leadership. He thought of his mother, who worked 2 jobs so Malik could focus on building. He thought of every version of himself that had once felt too quiet to be heard. That night, he went home and stood on his balcony, looking out over the city. Lights blinked like soft reminders. This is yours too. You earned this view. His phone buzzed. Messages poured in, congratulations, interviews, praise. But one caught his attention. It was a voice memo from a former classmate he hadn't spoken to since college. I saw the video. I used to think the system would change on its own. Today, you reminded me, it won't. But people like you will. Malik sat down, letting the city breathe around him. A week later, a national magazine ran a cover story titled, "From Removed to Ruler: The Man Who Took Back the Tower." The image was striking. Malik standing with folded arms in front of the Hamilton Tower entrance, the equity plaque gleaming in the background. But for Malik, the real moment came quietly. It was a Wednesday morning. Normal day. A young black boy, maybe 15, walked through the lobby with his father. They stopped in front of the plaque. The boy looked up and read it aloud. "Dad, he owns this place?" The man nodded. "Yes, he does." The boy looked around with new eyes. "So that means I could too," Malik, passing by, overheard. He paused, offered a small nod, and kept walking. He didn't need thanks. That moment was the reward, because that's what a real stand does, not just break barriers for one, but make space for many. The energy in the building had shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even spoken most of the time. But it was there, in the way staff greeted each other with more ease, in the way the hallways echoed with calm instead of tension, and in the way people no longer looked startled too. See Malik walk through. Weeks after the public announcement, Malik sat in his office overlooking the city, reviewing blueprints. They weren't for expansion. They were for transformation. The bottom 2 floors of Hamilton Tower, once leased to luxury retail stores that catered to exclusivity, were now being converted into something new, community space. He called it the Groundwork Initiative, a place for young entrepreneurs, especially those of color, who had ideas but no access to boardrooms. One wing would house small startup offices, another would offer free mentorship programs, coding classes, and business planning clinics. A room that had once held overpriced handbags would now hold dreams, real ones. He reached out to old contacts. Teachers, mentors, nonprofits. He called in favors. No one hesitated. Everyone wanted to be part of it. Across town, his story had already made its mark. Business magazines put his face on the cover. They dubbed him the man who bought the space. That rejected him. One major media outlet turned the lobby footage into a documentary short. The before, Malik being questioned, removed, doubted, and the after, Malik being welcomed, empowered, respected. The video was shared across the globe, but fame wasn't. What grounded Malik? He hadn't forgotten where he came from. One Saturday, without security or staff, Malik returned to the neighborhood where it all started. His mother's old house still stood on the corner. The porch looked smaller than he remembered, but the cracked sidewalk and leaning mailbox hadn't changed. He parked the car, stepped out, and walked the street slowly. Kids played ball between driveways. Music drifted from an open window. Some neighbors nodded politely, not recognizing him until he waved. One woman stepped out with a gasp. "Little Malik," he smiled. "Not so little anymore. You're in the news now," she said, beaming. "Doing big things," he chuckled. "Trying." She didn't ask for a photo. She didn't need one. Her pride lived in her eyes. Later that evening, back at Hamilton Tower, Malik hosted a quiet dinner on the top floor. No event planners, no investors. Just his mother and Danielle seated across from him as the skyline shimmered through tall glass panels. The table was small, the meal simple. His mother took it all in slowly, her eyes soft. "You dreamed of this?" she asked. "I dreamed of freedom," Malik replied. "This came with it." Danielle raised her glass. "To building what wasn't given, to reclaiming what they said we couldn't touch." They clinked glasses, laughed, talked late into the night. When they left, Malik lingered a little longer. The city glowed below, stretching in every direction like a tapestry of second chances. But the next morning was his favorite, early, still, quiet. He walked into the lobby with no announcement, no cameras, no entourage, just himself. The morning. Staff was arriving. Janitors clocked in. A young woman behind the reception desk greeted him. "Morning, Mr. Henderson," she said with a smile. He paused, smiled back. "Morning, Talia." She had been hired during the policy revamp. Sharp, empathetic, aware. She nodded respectfully as he walked by, returning to her screen. Malik moved through the space slowly, hands in his pockets. The marble floor beneath him gleamed, freshly polished. The lobby plaque, etched with the words "Equity lives here," stood tall at eye level. No one flinched when he passed. No one whispered. He was no longer an outsider. Not an exception. Just a man walking through. A space he now called his own. And that, he realized, was the victory. Not the headlines. Not the ownership title. But the quiet normalcy of belonging. He reached the far end of the lobby, paused by the revolving doors, and looked back. The same hallway, the same air, But it didn't carry weight anymore. It carried purpose. No fanfare. No speeches, just breath, just presence. He turned, stepped outside, and disappeared into the morning. And somewhere, etched into memory and truth, the story would always remain. They dragged him out thinking he didn't belong. He came back owning the ground they stood on.